The boy was 11 years old, standing at the edge of a frozen river in northern India, watching his mother's body being carried to the flames. He did not cry, not because he did not love her. He loved her more than he had words for, but something had broken open inside him that morning, something that would not close again for the rest of his life. He stood there in the bitter cold, the smoke rising, and felt the world go silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound. His mother had been the one who prayed. Every morning, before sunrise, before the house stirred, before the servants lit the lamps, she would kneel in the corner of her room and speak to God as if he were sitting right there across from her. She did not whisper. She did not perform. She simply talked to him about her children, about the poor in the village, about a boy she kept seeing in her dreams, a boy she believed was meant for something she could not yet name. That boy was her son. His name was Deepak Nath Arora. And standing at the river that morning, Deepak made a decision that he did not fully understand. He decided that whatever his mother had believed about him, he would find out if it was true. He had no idea what that decision would cost him. Deepak grew up in a Sikh family of considerable means in the Punjab region in the late 19th century. His father, a man of sharp intellect and sharper temper, had little patience for mysticism. He believed in land, in trade, in the practical management of things you could see and touch. Religion, he thought, was for women and the elderly. A man made his own way. Deepak was his father's son in many ways. He was quick, argumentative, proud. He could outread boys 3 years older than him. He had a kind of fire in him that made adults uncomfortable. Not the dangerous fire of a child who breaks things, but the unsettling fire of a child who asks questions that adults cannot answer. When his mother died, that fire did not go out. It turned inward. He began reading everything he could find. He read the Guru Granth Sahib the way his mother had taught him. He read passages from the Quran that a neighbor lent him. He got hold of a Bible, not an easy thing in his village at that time, and read through it in sections the way a hungry man eats, quickly and without stopping to taste. He was searching for something. He could feel it the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue. Close. Almost there. Not yet. When Deepak was 14, a British missionary came through the region, a quiet man named Mr. Hartley, with sun-damaged skin and a habit of pausing before he spoke, as if he were listening to something before answering. He set up a small school in the market district and offered free lessons to any boy who wanted them. Deepak's father forbade him to go. Deepak went anyway. He sat in the back row of that dusty room for 3 weeks before Mr. Hartley noticed him. Really noticed him, not just as a student filling a seat, but as a person who was listening with everything he had. One afternoon, after the other boys had left, Mr. Hartley asked him what he was looking for. Deepak said, "I want to know if God is real or if my mother was wrong." Mr. Hartley looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in a classroom." He handed Deepak a small Gospel of John in Punjabi. "Start here," he said, "and don't let anyone tell you the answer before you've had time to find it yourself." Deepak read it in one night. He did not sleep. He lay on his mat with the little book, reading by lamplight, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he reached the 18th chapter and felt something happen inside his chest that he had no language for. It was not emotion exactly. It was more like recognition, like meeting someone you had known a long time ago in a place you could no longer quite remember. He lay there until dawn, very still, not praying exactly, but listening. By the time the sun came up, Deepak Nath Arora was not the same person he had been the night before. His father found out within a week. The confrontation was not quiet. His father was not a man who expressed anger softly. He stood in the courtyard of their home and told Deepak that he had brought shame on the family name, that he was chasing the religion of colonizers, that his mother's prayers had turned his mind soft. Deepak stood and listened. He did not argue. He had learned, in those strange early weeks of his new faith, that the impulse to win arguments was sometimes the enemy of the truth you were trying to live. When his father finished, Deepak said simply, "I love you, and I cannot stop." His father threw him out of the house that same afternoon. He was 15 years old. He had the clothes on his back, the small Gospel of John, and about 6 rupees he had saved from running errands for the neighbors. He walked to the edge of the property, turned once to look at the house where he had grown up. the mango tree in the courtyard, the blue-painted shutters on his mother's old room. And then he turned away and began walking. He did not know where he was going. What happened next is the part of Deepak's story that is hardest to explain without sounding like you are making it up. Because what happened next was not dramatic in the way that makes for good storytelling. There were no angels. There were no visions. There was simply a series of small, ordinary moments that added up to something extraordinary. A Salvation Army captain in the next town took him in for a week. A Christian school teacher in Lahore let him sleep on the floor of his classroom in exchange for sweeping it. A widow in Amritsar fed him for 3 months and taught him to read English well enough to be dangerous. He kept moving. He kept reading. He kept listening for that voice he had first heard at 3 a.m. with a little Punjabi Gospel pressed flat on his chest. By the time he was 17, Deepak had walked several hundred miles across northern India, preaching in markets, in tea stalls, in the back rooms of sympathetic merchants, in the open fields at the edges of villages where no one else would have him. He had no formal training. He had no denomination behind him. He had no money. He had exactly one thing. He believed, with a certainty that he could not explain and had stopped trying to explain, that he had been called, not just invited. Called, the way a soldier is called to a post, the way a surgeon is called to an emergency, with a specificity that left no room for maybe. People listened to him. That was the strange thing. Not because he was polished. He was not polished. He was a teenager in rough clothes who had been walking for months and probably needed a meal. But when he spoke, in Punjabi, in Hindi, in the broken English he was still assembling, something in his voice made people go quiet. Something true was passing through him. They could feel it even when they could not name it. Word spread the way it always does when something real is happening. Quietly at first, then faster. When Deepak was 19, he decided to go to Tibet. This requires some explanation. Tibet in the early 20th century was not merely remote, it was deliberately closed. The chief religious authorities had sealed the borders to foreign influence, and Christian missionaries in particular were not welcome. Several had tried to enter and been turned back. Some had not come back at all. Deepak was aware of this. He went anyway. He crossed the Himalayan foothills in winter, which is not the season. Anyone crosses the Himalayan foothills if they have a choice. He wore a rough robe he had been given by a sadhu he met on the road because it offered better warmth than what he owned, and because it made him less visible as someone who did not belong. He carried no weapon. He carried a small Bible, some dried food, and a certainty that had become, by this point, something like bone. Structural, load-bearing, not subject to negotiation. The first village he entered, they arrested him within an hour. He was brought before the local authority, a man whose title and exact function Deepak would later describe with characteristic vagueness, referring to him simply as the official. The official looked at this thin young man who had walked into a restricted territory in winter, with no papers and no apparent plan, and asked him, through an interpreter, what exactly he thought he was doing. Deepak said he had come to tell people about Jesus. The official stared at him. Then he had him thrown in the local prison. The prison was a pit, literally. A pit cut into the earth, covered with wooden planks, cold beyond description. Deepak would spend 3 days in that pit. He would later say that those 3 days were among the most important of his life. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. He sat in the dark and cold, and he prayed, and he sang hymns to himself, and he talked to God the way his mother used to. As if God were sitting right there, not in some abstract heavenly location, but right there in the pit with him. On the 3rd day, the planks were pulled back and he was hauled out, escorted to the edge of the village, and told to leave and never come back. He walked to the next village and started again. This pattern repeated itself across Tibet over the following 2 years. Arrest, prison, expulsion, walk to the next village, begin again. What kept him going was not stubbornness exactly, though he had plenty of that. What kept him going was the people. Not all of them turned him away. Some sat with him in the night and listened. A woman who had lost her son gave him food and wept while he prayed over her. A monk came to him in secret 3 times over a week, asking questions that the monk clearly could not ask in daylight. A young man named something that Deepak could never quite pronounce right came to faith in a hayloft at 2 in the morning, and stood up afterward with a changed face that Deepak said he never forgot. These were not famous conversions. No one wrote them down at the time. No mission organization reported them. They happened in the dark, quietly, between people the world was not watching. But they were real, and to Deepak, they were enough. More than enough. They were everything. What the world was watching, or would eventually watch, came later. It came on a pass between two mountain villages, on a day when the weather turned without warning. Deepak was traveling with a small group of Tibetan converts. 8 people when the snow began, not a flurry. A real mountain snowstorm, the kind that blinds you within minutes and erases every landmark you thought you knew. They should have turned back. They could not turn back. The path behind them had already disappeared. They pressed forward for 3 hours into worsening conditions. And then the youngest of the group, a girl of perhaps 14, collapsed. Deepak carried her. That is the detail that Deepak himself almost never mentioned when he told this story, which is exactly why it is worth mentioning. He carried her on his back through a Himalayan snowstorm at altitude for what he estimated was 2 hours. Though he later said time became strange and he could not be certain, he prayed the entire time. Not formal prayer. He talked to God the way his mother had taught him, directly, plainly, as if God were walking right next to him in the snow. They reached the next village. They survived. All 8 of them. The girl recovered. That story spread through those mountain communities, the way stories spread when they are true and when they matter. Not through newspapers, not through mission reports. Through people telling people, the way all the important stories travel. When Deepak finally returned to India, in his early 20s, gaunt and frostbitten and more alive than he had ever been, the mission organizations were waiting for him. They wanted to send him back to Tibet properly this time, with funding, with support structures, with a defined role within an established denominational framework. Deepak sat through the meetings. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He was respectful. Then he said no. This was not what they expected. They had been expecting gratitude. Here was a young man from a poor background, self-educated, unaffiliated, who had somehow managed to do what trained missionaries with institutional support had failed to do: build actual relationships, actual communities of faith, in one of the most closed territories on earth. And they were offering him the thing he most needed: resources, legitimacy, safety. He said no. He told them as gently as he could manage that he believed he was supposed to back the same way he had gone the first time, alone, without institutional backing, not because institutions were bad. He was careful to say this, but because he believed that what opened doors in Tibet was not credentials or organizational affiliation. What opened doors was the absence of those things. A man with nothing, walking in, carrying nothing but a conviction. That was something they understood. That was something they could not dismiss as political, as imperial, as another arm of foreign power reaching into their world. He had to be poor to be trusted. He understood that. He accepted it. The mission organizations did not accept his refusal easily. There were more meetings. There were letters. There were men of considerable authority who sat across tables from Deepak and told him, with great patience and genuine concern, that what he was doing was reckless, unsustainable, and likely to get him killed. Deepak listened to every one of them. He went back to Tibet alone. The years that followed are difficult to trace with the precision that historians prefer, because Deepak did not keep records in the way that institutions keep records. What survives is fragments. Letters written to a small circle of friends. Reports from other missionaries who encountered people in Tibet who spoke of a wandering Indian preacher. The testimonies of Tibetan believers gathered decades later by researchers who were trying to piece the story together. What those fragments show is a life of extraordinary, unglamorous faithfulness. He was arrested more times than he could later count. He slept in places that the word "ru" does not adequately cover. He went days without food with a regularity that damaged his health permanently. He was beaten on at least 3 separate occasions by people who viewed his presence as an offense. He also sat with the dying. He also prayed with the despairing. He also walked into villages in the middle of nowhere and found people who had been praying for years for something they could not name. And he would stay with them as long as he was allowed. and then he would move on. And what he left behind was not a mission station, or a church building, or an institutional structure of any kind. What he left behind was people who had met God. He came back to India periodically to recover, to eat properly for a few weeks, to let his body repair itself, to sit with the small community of friends who had formed around him and who prayed for him constantly. He did not stay long. He was always restless in comfort in a way he was never restless in difficulty. This is one of the paradoxes of Deepak's life that people who knew him struggled to describe. He was not an ascetic in the sense of someone who believed that suffering was holy in itself, who pursued hardship as a spiritual discipline. He did not romanticize poverty. When he was given a good meal, he ate it with obvious pleasure. When he was given a warm place to sleep, he slept. But the comfort never held him. There was always, underneath it, the pull. Back to the mountains, back to the cold, back to the people in the villages who had no one coming to them. He once wrote to a friend, "I cannot stay here. I do not mean this place. I mean here in the easy place. Something does not let me." He was in his late 30s when the illness began. It started as what seemed like ordinary exhaustion, reasonable, given the life he had been living, but it did not lift. By the time he was 40, it was clear to everyone around him that something was seriously wrong. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was tuberculosis. Not a surprise, given the conditions he had spent 20 years living in. The doctors told him to rest, completely, for at least a year. Deepak rested for 3 months. Then he began making plans to go back. His friends argued with him. A doctor who had become one of his closest supporters laid out, in clear and detailed terms, what another journey to Tibet at this stage of the illness would likely mean. Deepak listened. He thanked the doctor. He said he understood. And then he said something that the doctor wrote down afterward, because he could not get it out of his head. "I am not trying to extend my life. I am trying to spend it." He did not make it back to Tibet. He made it as far as a small Christian community in the foothills, where he was taken in and cared for by a group of believers who had known him for years. He spent his last weeks there, unable to travel, increasingly unable to do much more than lie in the sunlight that came through the window in the afternoons and talk to the people who came to sit with him. He talked to them the way his mother had talked to God, directly, personally, as if there were nothing more important happening anywhere in the world than this conversation, right here, between these two people. He asked them about their families. He prayed over them. He told them stories about Tibet. The snowstorm, the pit, the monk who came in secret, the boy in the hayloft with the changed face. He was not afraid. That is the one thing that everyone who was with him at the end agreed on, independently, without consulting each other. He was not afraid. He was, if anything, curious, as if death were a door he had been moving toward for a long time and was now finally close enough to see the light underneath it. Deepak Nath Arora died in the early spring, with the window open and the sound of birds outside and a friend holding his hand. He was 43 years old. There was no obituary in the major papers. There was no memorial service organized by a denomination. There was no mission report filed, no institutional record to mark the end of his work. What there was this. In Tibet, in villages scattered across the mountains that he had walked through in the cold and the snow and the dark, there were people who had met God because of him. They had no buildings, they had no hierarchy. They had, in many cases, no contact with any organized church anywhere. What they had was a faith that had come to them through a thin young Indian man who arrived with nothing and asked nothing, and left behind only the thing he had been given to give. Decades later, when researchers began trying to trace the history of Christian faith in those closed mountain regions, they kept finding this thread, this person, this name, Deepak, spoken with a kind of reverence by very old people who remembered a man who had walked through in the winter and stayed for a few days and changed everything. One woman, interviewed in her 90s, said something that the researcher wrote down verbatim because she did not know what else to do with it. He came with nothing. He left with nothing. But something stayed. If you have ever felt like you were not enough, not educated enough, not connected enough, not resourced enough to matter, then Deepak Nath Arora's life has something to say to you. Not a formula, not a 5-step plan, not a comfortable reassurance that everything will work out. Something harder than that, something truer. He did not succeed by acquiring what he lacked. He succeeded by going anyway, by walking into the places that told him no, by carrying the girl in the snow, by sitting in the pit and singing, by turning down the resources that would have made him credible in the eyes of institutions, but invisible in the eyes of the people he was trying to reach. He spent 43 years on earth and left almost no institutional trace. What he left was people. And in the economy of the kingdom he believed in with every bone in his body, people were exactly enough. If this story moved you, if something in you recognized something in him, we would love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to go deeper, the next story we've prepared for you is one that we think belongs right next to this one. A woman who was told she had no future, who built one out of nothing in a country that was not her own, and whose name is still spoken with reverence in the places she walked through. That story is waiting for you.